Greetings and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today across the globe. Now, I can say because we have two people right now from Australia. So, I, Reema Bhandari, an advocate, a mediator, Supreme Court of India, and a trainer. I'm honored to host today's third lecture of our International Virtual Mediation Summer School 2022. It's a series organized by Nivaran on overview and style of conflict, conflict management, and transformation. I also welcome Mr. Nikhil Jain, an advocate on record and mediator, Supreme Court of India, who will be moderating along with me and will give the closing remarks. He is practicing from past 19 years and has been a treasurer of Advocate or Record Association of Supreme Court of India. Welcome, Nikhil. Uh, so speaking about Nivaran first, I would say that it is a body of mediators from the Supreme Court of India working for the advancement of amicable settlements of disputes through mediation, while also spreading knowledge on mediation intricacies. In pursuance of our goal, we have conducted two annual international virtual mediation summer schools earlier. This is the third one. Three international seminars and webinars. We have always received encouragement from our honorable judges, our senior mediators, academicians from India and across the globe. Uh, I would now like to take the opportunity to welcome our guest speaker for the session today, Ms. Sarah Blake, who is a multi-award winning corporate trainer, conflict strategist, mediator, media commentator, and TEDx speaker. So many things she's doing. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you
She
for
has
having me.
provided she has provided conflict intervention services for various groups over a staggering period of approximately 25 years. Sarah provides expert consultation and advises to federal, state, and international parties on conflict and dispute resolution. She has also been recently recognized for her invaluable contribution to international peacemaking community, as well as her remarkable approach to conflict resolution. She has facilitated in decreasing community violence and bring meaningful cultural change. Sarah's approach is to mold her plans according to the needs of her clients, which allows them to make significant changes and breakthroughs and reach their full potential. Well, we all know that mediation is a way of managing conflicts, and it has become a crucial means to reach an amicable settlement not only in personal and commercial matters, but also in international, political, and social matters. The act of mediating makes the mediator an integral part of conflict mediation, a conflict resolution. Mediator, being a manager of conflict resolution, applies various conflict management strategies depending upon the facts of each case to handle conflicts in a very efficient and sensible manner. Therefore, it becomes essentially important for a mediator to understand the causes of conflict, various dimensions of conflict like conflict core, conflict triangle, conflict spiral, and above all, various conflict management styles and strategies. It is undeniable fact that conflict, if not essential, is an integral part of our every days of human beings' life. It comes in various shapes and forms and can be destructive if not controlled. Understanding conflict causes of its escalation and principles of conflict management is the bedrock for any successful mediation. Thus, it is important to look beneath the surface to identify deeper issues. With that, I have a small introduction about our topic today. I would now hand over the reins to Ms. Sarah Blake to further expound on this vast topic that is understanding conflicts and its management. Welcome, Sarah. All
Thank you.
yours now.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for that introduction. I feel really humbled to be joining all of you today because you all bring so much experience and knowledge and wisdom. So I consider myself really privileged and excited to be listening to all of you. My most exciting part of this presentation is when you all ask me questions at the end. So please feel free to put your questions up in the chat page. I'm going to pull up the slide now. Hopefully we have no technical problems. But just a little bit about myself. Thank you for that introduction. I am really passionate about this business of conflict resolution, of peacemaking. I'm a second generation practitioner. My father was a barrister and one of the early mediators in Australia. So I've lived the language of mediation and dispute resolution from a very young age. And I think this has shaped the way that I do this business, and it shaped the language that I learn. So please excuse me as I indulge in a conversation. I have tried to pitch it in a way that's accessible both to those that are getting started, but also to those of you that have been around for a long time. And so I hope that enables us all to check back in about our basics, but also take the conversation to a deeper level. I'm just going to share the PowerPoint now. Hopefully we won't have any problems with that, and pull up my notes. You've heard some wonderful presentations already in the opening ceremony. You've heard about the context of how we've found ourselves in mediation, why mediation matters. You've also had the chance to hear about ethics, ethical issues, confidentiality, and the tensions between neutrality and self-determination. But why do we have these conversations? Why are we leaning into mediation? Today, you're going to hear from me about conflict and conflict styles, including conflict management, intervention, and transformation. And I hope and look forward to learning from you as much as me sharing my story. But to kick things off, because I want to get you engaged in this conversation as well, I have a little bit of fun slide for us to get the interaction happening. You'll see here on this slide a range of emotions: angry, ready, hopeless, curious, uncertain, suspicious, nervous, confident, fearful. Maybe you're feeling afraid today. These are all different emotions that we will feel throughout the day. I just want you to take a moment. Maybe your day is just starting. Maybe like Bridget and myself, your day is coming to a close. I want you just to reflect on for a moment a range of emotions that you might have felt. You might be feeling unwell. You might be feeling worried. You might be feeling a deep sense of devastation or grief. You might have experienced a moment of loneliness or powerlessness, and perhaps you're feeling completely optimistic and excited. I want you just to pause for a moment and check on your hand. How many of those emotions can you name in a matter of moments? Maybe in the chat function, you could put up for me a number. How many can you say you've felt over the last little bit? And I'm just going to give a moment for that chat function to get busy, because I want to know, how many emotions can you name that you've felt in the last little bit? Have I got anyone coming up yet? Now, the reason why I get you to start thinking about emotions is that it's very easy. Someone's feeling excited. Great. Me too. It's so easy for us to remember perhaps those high emotions. You're going to get to the end of the day and probably one or two emotions will stick out for you. But it's really important to remember that through the course of the day, we're going to feel a wide range of emotions. We're going to have highs and lows, but mostly just a lot of in-betweens. And as we navigate and try to make decisions and engage with each other, what happens when we're dealing with conflict is we mostly remember those experiences that are negative, those high emotions, and they impact and influence how we lean in and engage with others. Now, as mediators who are walking in this complex space, it's really important that we too are aware of how we are. How are we feeling today? How are we as we step into this mediation room? How are we as we hold people in really difficult spaces? because how we are impacts how other people respond to us. So I just wanted to get you going, and I can see some fantastic responses. Optimistic. Someone's felt powerless today, uncertain. Someone's felt ready. So thank you for sharing those, because I think it's really critical that as practitioners, we both reflect on ourselves as much as how we reflect on others. So let's jump on through to the next slide. Let's talk about understanding conflict. I want you to step into the messy space of conflict. I want you to connect with how that experience might be for parties. I think it's easy for us as practitioners to assume that everything's okay, to feel discomfort with what we've got going on. But it's really critical sometimes to just pause and think, how might parties be experiencing what this is, this process of mediation, of conflict management, of high conflict? We're equipped. We deal with it a lot. We get used to it. We kind of normalize the experience. But that's not the case for most people who find themselves in conflict, particularly when it escalates up through to courts. We as mediators walk in this complex space. It can be hard, painful, and sometimes rewarding. For me, the most powerful mediators are the ones who can bring an understanding and can empathize with parties about the conflict. And at the same time, they hold clarity about boundaries, roles, and structures. There's this tension that really good mediators can hold. It's really important that we understand about conflict. We are in a position then to better respond, to better design our response mechanisms. When we understand conflict, we are able to ask parties, what is it that you're looking for? How can we help you manage these tensions? Are they looking for guidance and resolution? Or are they looking to transform something and innovate? So I want to get back to a one-on-one on conflict and how people might respond. And it sounds, going back to basics, or why do we need to do that? But I've found in my own practice that this process of going back to basics reframes and challenges the way that I then engage with people. What we know about conflict is that conflict isn't part of our everyday lives. It's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it often highlights the need for change. However, as we know, it's people's responses to conflict that makes it a negative experience or a positive experience. Uri says that conflicts often result when one or more party is in conflict or adopt a position that allows only one solution to meet their needs, and that generally interests can be satisfied in a variety of ways. As mediators, we'll say that they've become positional. They're very fixed in their thinking. To resolve this, it has to be done my way. And in mediation, we're trying to open that space. I want to challenge your views on conflict, because I think that so often we just assume that it's this bad thing. I want to challenge your thinking, because then you can challenge others. Perhaps conflict can be an opportunity to problem solve rather than fight. This talks to a shift in mindset, a different philosophical approach to the way they're negotiating and dealing with these problems. Thomas Crum talks about conflict in terms of nature and says that nature uses conflict as its primary motivator for change, creating beautiful beaches, canyons, mountains, and pearls. We just think of those storms that roll in and they transform the landscape. Maybe not how we wanted or anticipated, but something nevertheless different. Crum goes on to say that conflict is natural. It's neither positive or negative, it just is. It's not whether you have conflict in your life. Instead, it's what you do with that conflict that makes a difference. But often that's not what we're taught. I want you to think about how you think about conflict. The thoughts and behaviours are informed by our cultural systems, our legal systems, our values, and our experiences. The way we think about and respond to conflict is shaped by what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've lived, sometimes what we've learned and imagined. What we often see of conflict has become normalized negative behavior. It's that negative or destructive patterns of behavior. And so, of course, we've learned to fear it. We see it as a bad thing. We see from our politicians very often a focus on winning at all costs, instead of that ability to negotiate what is best for all of us. On TV, on media, we see the drama, the reality shows, where ratings increase the more drama there is, where conflict and dysfunction and aggression are actually celebrated or prioritized or focused on. We see leaders who are promoted because of their ability to get the job done at all costs and somehow diminishing the people around them. We also know that many communities are struggling to deal with difference. They're becoming divided by these uncertainties, the unknown, the inability to control what's around them, and conflict grows. Now, more than ever, as a world, we need mediators and peacemakers who are able to build those bridges. But here's the interesting thing about understanding conflict. Because too often I see mediators who themselves don't like conflict, who are perhaps uncomfortable with it and try to rush people through negotiating. Quickly, let's get to the fix it stage. And then there are the mediators who are uncomfortable with emotions, who silence them and redirect them back to the facts, because that's safe. I know how to deal with that. Whilst I understand that there is a time and a place for these approaches, they shouldn't be our go-to, because it's in the messiness of conflict that the true gems of solutions emerge. This messiness of conflict is there to remind us of what really matters, of what matters to us in these moments. So what about these styles of conflict, the cycle of conflict? And what happens? We know in conflict, generally in life, a disagreement happens. It might be about what we're going to have for dinner. It might be about who took the rubbish in or not. It might be about who got the credit for the work promotion, who got the work that they did. It might be a disagreement about the quality on delivery of a contract. Whatever it is, something happens and there's a disagreement. Quickly, parties shift into a blame mentality. It's not my fault, it's their fault. Tensions escalate. Communication stops. People stop listening. They stop sharing. They become really fixated and fixed that what they have to say matters most. Again, things escalate. Parties become positional. They don't want to shift. There's this desire for justice, but it's justice on their terms. Is a search for truth, but truth of their terms. This position approach engages and escalates to hostility, and chaos erupts. You might be in a community, in a workplace, at the international level, but we see it again and again, these patterns occurring. It's often talked about conflict in terms of the 5 stages of conflict. Generally, theoretically, we acknowledge that conflict isn't a linear process. Rather, it's a moving beast. It's an ebb and flow that continues to shift as emotions shift, as we gather more information or less information. I've put up on the slide here just a really simple conflict cycle. And what I've found recently in using this diagram in my trainings and even in my pre-mediation stages, it allows me to name for parties what's been going on for them. Because I think often we get so fixated when we're in conflict about how it's impacting me. What do I feel right now? So when I'm able to talk about the cycles of conflict, it really kind of normalizes and takes some pressure away from them. And they start to be able to have a bit of space to be more rational and less emotional. In general terms, we talk about latent conflict. Participants are not even aware that there's a conflict brewing. For those of us that work in the conflict space, I can bet my bottom dollar that all of you will see signals much earlier than everyone else around, hey, there's something brewing, there's something going wrong here. And it's not surprising because we've been trained to look for those signals, those insights, that most other people aren't. So they don't have an awareness of when that tension starts to rise, not really until an escalation happens. Sometimes that's talked about the emergent stage or an escalation. Suddenly people are aware of a conflict. It then shifts into what I've called a dispute or a disagreement. This is the space of hurt, of stalemate. People are feeling strongly. The conflict is manifested, and it's really, there's got a clear frame around what's going on. With good support and with good intervention, often then we're able to de-escalate the conflict and move into a place of resolution or settlement. But it doesn't end there, because we also have a step beyond that. For those of us that are interested in long-lasting sustainable peace in transformation, the post-resolution stage is around what happens post-agreement, post-conflict. It's about peace, it's about healing, it's about reconciliation and transformation. So when we look comprehensively around that cycle of conflict, we start to see it as a moving thing, recognizing that sometimes we move back to move forward. And again, we're jumping back into causes of conflict. And why is this so important? We as mediators and practitioners, we're used to thinking about causes of conflict. We're used to assessing and thinking and digging down into those interests. That's our language, it's our home bases. But most people don't do this work. Most people are so caught up in the conflict themselves that they can't even think about what's driving this. I can't tell you the number of mediations I've done when I ask people to tell me about this conflict and what caused it. Well, I'm not really sure, but I know he's done the wrong thing and I just want him to give me the money and settle this. They've got so caught up in the conflict itself that they haven't made space to reflect on what's causing it. We can often frame the causes of conflict really easily: resources and money, people, interests and values, information and situations, structures, power and system. And yes, again, it seems really simple, but it's simple for us because we're used to doing this work. What I do is I build this conversation into my pre-mediation work because I'm helping people not just resolve the conflict, but understand it. Because when they understand what's going on, they're better equipped to make good decisions. Because remember, what drives these conflicts? It's people. And people are driven by their emotions, their fears and their needs. What happens when people are in conflict? They want to be heard. Perhaps they want to take a stance with a narrow focus for their own perceived interests. How often do we see that? Sometimes people are not even clear about what their interests are. They instinctively take a position because it reduces anxiety, uncertainty, and confusion. It's kind of like, I get what this is, so I can control this. People in conflict often struggle to view the other person's side. Their conflict story is based around themselves and their impact on them. They can't name or articulate or recognize that they've had a part in this story as well and might be impacting the other person. I'm navigating a negotiation and workplace mediation about this right now, and it's getting in the way of them getting good outcomes. People in conflict listen to gossip and opinions of others, particularly opinions of others who reinforce their own fears and concerns. They build alliances. They want people to agree with them because it makes them feel validated. They pigeonhole information and stereotype people because it's easier, again, for them to make sense of what's going on. People in conflict spread misinformation, often unconsciously. We've got to help unpack all of that, but we've got to do it in a way that doesn't diminish them. because otherwise it's not a safe place for them to lean into a hard conversation. We know people in conflict often adapt a fight mentality as they seek to control and demand, punish others to reward themselves, explode or dump responsibility on the other person and deny their own ownership of any part of the problem. It's a challenge for us as mediators to navigate this space. So when we can put language to it that allows them to bridge that space, not only do we empower them, but we empower ourselves as practitioners, because suddenly the mediation model, the tactics that we use have meaning that people can relate to and engage with. Conflict is fueled by people and how they choose to respond. Isn't that really at the heart of what we're helping them to navigate? So as we know in conflict, and I'm sure you're going to hear from others about this because all of this overlaps into what we do. Everyone responds differently to conflict. At the beginning of this session, I challenged you to think about how you deal with conflict. What are your responses to conflict? We know from research that when people feel anxiety, particularly around conflict, it instigates and creates that instinctual response: fight, flee, freeze, fawn. Too often we see that primary response about getting defensive. Let's have a fight about it. Sometimes people run away from the danger. They hide their head and they don't want to deal with the hard issues. They freeze, or they immediately start acting to try to please everyone and avoid the conflict at all costs. Now, these initial responses might actually be really important and critical, particularly in situations of violence. Okay, so I'm not saying that these are wrong, but I'm also encouraging us to think about how we can help parties move out of this space into a more emotionally regulated space that enables them to think differently about conflict. Because if they are still in this instinctual reactive phase, they're not actually going to be able to take on information properly. They're not actually going to be able to listen, and they can't then make good decisions. So any agreement you reach, if they're still in this instinctual space, is unlikely to be sustainable. I know you've heard about this all before. I'm pretty sure you have. Conflict management styles, Thomas and Kilman. We talk about this a lot when we train new mediators, right? Around how people respond to conflict. It's good to check in, right? And just remind ourselves. One of the things that I often do when I'm talking about these different styles of conflict response is to help people understand where they are given the situation. Sometimes when we talk about the competitive response versus the collaborative or cooperative response, it doesn't really land. But when I'm doing a lot of cross-cultural work, for instance, I have to shift the language that I use. So I'll talk about that shark or that crocodile being the competitive personality. And that competitive personality is really strong in their territory, right? They don't let anybody in. They hold that line. They attack first. They don't want to listen to anyone else, but they are very strong on what's right and wrong. Now, sometimes that's critical in a negotiation, but in a mediation, it's not always useful. So our challenge as mediators is to assess what's going on. What response style are people adopting, and is it useful to the situation? It's not up to us to change it, but it is up to us to perhaps consider and ask questions. So I want you guys all, encourage you to think about this differently, because understanding our responses to conflict and conflict itself helps us better design a strategic response to how we move forward. For me, I'm always mindful of not making a situation worse and ensuring that as I engage in the conflict space, I'm aware of how I am and how parties are as I consider how best to support them moving forward. So we've heard about mediation and what response model is best? It really, for me, comes down to the questions that I ask. What are parties looking for? Is there a continuing relationship dimension? Do they consider this as an opportunity for innovation? Is timing, cost, and confidentiality an issue? What are reputational risks, and are there ongoing challenges? Or is this issue just a once-off? These are all the types of questions that I engage with during my pre-mediation and assessment stage. And again, even having done that prior to the mediation itself, they're still important questions to check back in as we go through. You'll actually start to see that these type of questions become really key as we reality test, as we push them towards what are your options, what are the realities of that, best and alternative. So these are kind of fundamental questions that shape not just what we do, but how we do it. But we also need to start thinking about conflict more broadly and how we respond, because there are many different ways to deal with or attempt to resolve conflict. Sometimes mediation is right, but sometimes it's not as well. So whether it's from an informal to a formal negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and or litigation, there are blended models and there are sometimes overlapping interventions and approaches. It really depends on how we look at the problem itself. What is it the parties are dealing with, and how can we best help them to resolve it? Sometimes clients just need us to deal with a specific dispute, one particular issue like a contract breach, failure to meet payments, separation of a company, reputational or other damages. It's not to say there's layers within this, but the framework around this conflict is much narrower. Traditionally, these cases are looked at in isolation. And on the most part, people have sought resolution through courts. But what we're seeing is the increasing uptake of mediation. And in mediation, we know that we try to avoid the notion of winner takes all. We recognise that mediation can leave space for a broader range of resolutions, that it can deal with confidentiality differently, timing, costs, all differently. The Singapore Convention on Mediation lays out all the benefits of mediation. And I think it's really important that as we assess a conflict situation, we are asking what outcome is the client seeking? What do they actually want from this situation? Because that should inform what we ourselves do. You'll see here that I've talked about the emergence of a conflict, conducting an assessment or situation risk, and that question of what clients are looking for. I've then gone on to just describe some of those factors that distinguish what intervention is right. And here you'll start to see where it gets interesting, because I've framed the conversation as conflict management. It reduces risk, it manages tensions, and establishes a process for early intervention or resolution. When we talk about conflict management, from my perspective, we're talking the life cycle of a conflict itself, not just from a one-off incident, but perhaps looking at more systemic issues and cultural issues as well. I know that more of the work that I'm doing increasingly is around people wanting support in conflict management. It's recognizing that conflict doesn't necessarily go away, but there will be continuing needs to reassess, to train, to look at what we do and improve. Sometimes the right response is about conflict intervention. And I talk about specific interventions, usually looking like implemented by an independent third party with a focus on specific issue resolution. I can see a spelling error, sorry. But typically we look to negotiation, mediation, arbitration, conciliation, or litigation. They're very specific intervention models. What I know of conflict management is that sometimes conflict management includes specific interventions. It might be that mediation forms part of that response plan. And if that doesn't work, we may then need to escalate up. So there's a recognition that as we manage a situation, we might need to conduct certain interventions. And then we come to conflict transformation, which often combines both the management, the intervention, and innovation. Transformation emerges from a growth mindset that participants bring to the process. But here's the thing, we as mediators can also help encourage and shape the opportunity for innovation and growth. So it often includes this notion of healing and a change in the landscape that enabled the problem to emerge. Transformation is taking what is a problem and turning it into an opportunity for innovation, for growth, for change. By doing that, we look at the opportunity for resolution in a more comprehensive framework, that sense of peacemaking, of conclusion where there is healing. This is understanding what a good outcome might look like. So I want to dive down into conflict management a little bit more, because at the beginning we talked about how critical this is to the jobs that we do. It's really this emerging recognition that conflict management is forming part of a case management model. We can't often resolve conflict. In fact, we don't want conflict to go away, because then we repress what is there and important to deal with. Rather, it becomes, how can we manage these risks and tensions with a focus on the future? It's important to remind parties that rarely do we get that perfect ending. I was talking to someone just the other day and saying, as mediators, we're not in the business of rainbows and unicorns and fairy tales. I wish that I could wave my magic wand, but life is much more complex than that. Instead, I'm here to guide them through a difficult conversation so that together they might be better able to make wise decisions. When we engage in conflict management, we bring a wider skill set and a more multidisciplinary approach to what we do. Sometimes we talk about it in terms of case management, but real conflict management is about how we reduce the risk that these tensions will erupt into a major conflict. Often, this has emerged from the recognition of some polarity thinking, seemingly intractable positions between parties with diverse values and goals. How do we resolve this? How do we bridge forward when parties are seemingly so far apart? In conflict management, we assess the context and the content of the challenge. We assess the risk and the opportunity, and we provide intervention support, which may include mediation. And we empower clients with the skills and the capacity to better manage into the future. I'm excited by this because it means that I can combine my notion of empowerment and education with that of a mediator and bring my, developed sense and understanding of conflict to the table. So if that's conflict management, what then is conflict intervention? Conflict intervention is spoken of often in terms of resolution, and that by following a structured process, parties will be able to resolve the conflict that has emerged. This is often where mediation fits in, and I'm sure you've all seen some take on the dispute resolution continuum, from negotiation, mediation, arbitration, litigation, and resolution, where parties have more influence and control over the outcome and the process to less control and influence about the agreement. It is that level of authority and who holds it. I don't want to drum on about the differences of those different response models, but all of them on this continuum are much more focused on a specific frame of a dispute. So they don't often look about that more holistic model. And I think that for me distinguishes the difference between a conflict intervention and a conflict management approach. Unless probably you're dealing with more high conflict situations. So high conflict is a really different experience and a different skill set required. And in those cases, we might be doing mediation, but that mediation must be part of a broader picture, because we can't isolate what's going on more broadly in the context to the outcomes that we're looking for. And then we slide into this notion of conflict transformation. It's moving away from the notion that conflict is a bad thing and that somehow we should sweep it away and not talk about it. I know in the past, in my nan's generation, for instance, you'd put away that conflict into the back closet and nobody would ever talk about it again in the future. What conflict transformation suggests, particularly by John Lederach in 2003, he wrote that conflict transformation is a framework that emphasizes peace as embedded in justice, the building of the right relationships and social structures through a radical respect for human rights and non-violence as a way of life. I think this speaks to something of the vocation of mediation and peacemaking. It's this recognition that dealing with reaching an agreement isn't necessarily the end of the conflict process, because we know in real life people may reach an agreement but will still have this sense of injustice or a lack of closure. So when we talk about conflict transformation, it's the capacity of us as mediators to help parties navigate to a deeper healing, to a deeper resolution. Now that will look very different for people, and it may require very different skill sets. So we need to be really conscious about what we legitimately can support people with. We're not counsellors, but we might suggest they go and get some support. It really becomes a different philosophical way to approach the business of peacemaking. They go on to talk about the difference between resolution and transformation simply as how do we end something not desired, and a transformation being how to end something destructive and build something desired. When we talk about resolution, the time frame is often short time frame, but in transformation, it's mid to long term. In resolution, we view conflict and the need to de-escalate it because that will fix everything. But in transformation, there's an understanding that conflict is a dynamic ebb and flow. It's a part of our lives. So it's about encouraging people to learn to be okay with those dynamics, recognizing that perhaps it's not an either or outcome, but rather how can we manage these tensions moving forward? Being right and the right decision, having power and being heard. How do we empower others, but also respect the judicial authority? These are all tensions that we can explore as we seek to transform a conflict. It really becomes about what do the parties need to move forward? And is healing possible? And if so, what might that look like? In the work that I've done in remote communities, particularly here in Australia, there's a recognition that a conflict necessarily requires an element of healing. We can lance the boil, but if we haven't dealt with what's causing that deeper infection, it will continue to occur. So a transformation of conflict is a recognition that healing is a fundamental element of conflict resolution, of conflict management, and allowing other parties, the parties themselves, to move beyond this negative experience. So I wanted to summarize a few tips and tricks, but as dispute resolvers, we always find ourselves walking in murky waters. People in conflict have often reached a point of hopelessness, where emotions and sound decision-making often collide. As mediators, it is critical that we ourselves understand conflict and are comfortable in this space, because only then can we really help them to move towards better outcomes. How do we do this then? By understanding our role. We need to consider 1, what is it the parties want from us? 2, what do we have legitimate authority to do? So what is our scope? Because that's really key so that we don't slide into and out of our roles. And 3, how might we best implement this process so that it does no harm? So that we maximize the opportunities for change and resolution, and that we can manage the risks appropriately. How are we helping them to manage conflict, reach a resolution, or transform this situation? Understanding those differences is critical as we design a meaningful process and guide parties through it. Ultimately, mediation is about helping parties reach a point where they can move forward sustainably, fairly, and effectively. And to do this, we need clarity of our role and what they're looking for. So I hope that this session has planted some seeds of curiosity, and that perhaps it has empowered you with some confidence to step into this messy space, these emotions, and understanding these different roles that we may carry as mediators. It's about bringing curiosity and problem solving and having confidence. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for explaining the reasons of conflict and what we can do to, what kind of strategies we should use to resolve them. Meanwhile, I would, before starting our question and answer, I just want to welcome Ms. Renee M. Baptist, President, St. Vincent Bar Association and co-chairman, ADR Committee, Commonwealth Lawyers Association, who has just joined us. Welcome, ma'am, to our lecture series. I just start with a few questions are there in the chat box. First question I just want to ask Sarah is that why, Sarah, it is important for a mediator to understand the causes of conflict, especially when the outcome is in the hands of the parties.
Look, I think that as mediators, understanding the general causes of conflict helps us ask better questions when we get into the mediation room. So if we don't have a baseline of what's going on, it becomes very difficult to create the right sharp questions that gets to the heart of what's going on. We'll stay then on a much, if you think of the iceberg, if we don't have those right questions, it becomes very hard to get underneath the water and to bring up to the surface the complex layers that drive conflict.
There's one.
Yes, sir. Sorry, Nikhil, you can continue. Yeah.
There's one question. As a conflict strategist, how do you suggest someone so that they could bridge the differential gap arising out of a conflict to escalation arising out of polarization?
How do I bridge the differential gap arising out of a conflict to escalation and arising out of polarization? Look, I think as a conflict strategist, what I'm doing is challenging them and helping them to think about conflict differently. So I ask a lot of reality testing type questions, and I lean into particularly this notion of polarization. What I want to do in these situations is not diminish their values, because what's happened is that people have become quite adamant that their views are right. And I don't want to attack those views, but I want to create a moment of curiosity. So I'll ask questions around, I can hear that that matters a lot to you. Have you thought about why this might not align with the other party? What do you think matters to them? So I'm asking questions that don't challenge their own sense of self, but rather encourages them to think perhaps from the other person's perspective. What I'm doing from a strategic perspective is starting to try to take some of the emotive out of it and getting them to think broader. So I think more from a, hey, we may not get a perfect outcome, but is there something that you can both live with?
So asking the right questions actually so that they can understand where they are wrong while doing the reality testing is the key to the answer. Am I right, Sarah?
I think so, but I just want to say not necessarily that they're wrong, particularly in matters where there's polarization, because their views might and are probably legitimate for them. So it's not saying, hey, you're both right or you're both wrong, but hey, you both might be right. So can we come up with an agreement that values both of what you bring to the table, which is infinitely harder, right, than being able to say, hey, you might be wrong there.
I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. So there's another question. It is ADR applicable to cases of human rights dispute resolution where the state is an important party in the dispute resolution? Are there any working examples in Australia for ADR in human rights?
So many good points
It's
to
there
take
in the
this
chat
conversation.
box. Yeah, if you want
Yeah,
to
just
read them
looking.
again, it's there in the chat box too. Yeah.
Look, I think that, well, look, certainly the United Nations is advocating mediation as a way to help resolve some of these issues. In Australia recently, there's been an increasing attention paid to remediation. How do you work with industry and corporations who might find themselves having done the wrong thing? Perhaps whether it's with slavery or economy, the environment, and how can we help them work with those that are most impacted to get a better social justice outcome? This can be really tricky when the state is a player in the game. It becomes a matter of managing person. Hear me okay? Yeah. So it can be very difficult to manage the competing priorities of state, of industry, and those who have had injustice, have experiences of injustice. Here in Australia, we're wrestling with it. Native title is a really great example of where human rights disputes around access to land, stolen generation, a whole pile of other injustice issues impact Indigenous and First Nations people to move forward. And Australia is wrestling on how do we deal with this respectfully and give honour and respect to our First Nations people. I know on my own personal experience that mediation has been one of the few processes that can empower people in this space if it's done well. But to do it well means to balance power dynamics, to challenge the state, for instance, in how they usually negotiate and get them to think about perhaps doing that differently. So we have to juggle and build confidence of all parties to be able to negotiate respectfully.
Great.
There's another question, Sarah. Is mediation and conflict resolution applicable to medical legal cases also?
Look, certainly it is, I think, in the insurance space, medical insurance space, mediation has been used to resolve issues significantly, and for a long time, certainly here in Australia. But I do know of other cases in the UK and in Canada, and I would imagine in the US as well, where mediation and conflict resolution is being used to resolve medico-legal issues, particularly because of the emotional impact of the parties involved. So it can leave scope and space for varying degrees of resolution that might look very different should it go to court.
Okay, the next question is by Afreen Chaudhary, asking that since it is important for the mediator to be comfortable with conflict, could you please expand more on what comfort with conflict means from the mediator's perspective?
Yes, look, I would love to. First of all, if your parties start getting a little bit heated in the conversation, I don't jump on it straight away. I've already framed my rules of engagement at the beginning and said, look, you might hear some things that are uncomfortable to you. You might start to feel a little bit of anxiety. Perhaps they're going to say things that make you feel really angry. That's okay. You're going to have a chance to respond. And then during the mediation, they might get a bit heated. There might be a bit of name calling. I'm not going to jump on it straight away because it actually, if I do that, it represses the depth of the conversation, but I jump on it if it's creating a safety issue, if the power then starts to intimidate, and particularly around domestic violence and control issues. So I need to be comfortable with the discomfort and uncertainty that comes with conflict. And if you can't walk that space, if you're stepping on eggshells and like, oh, I don't like this, it's going to be very hard for other people to feel confident that you can hold them, that you've got them right now.
And Sarah, I think I also just want to add, I need your actually comments on that. At times, we as mediators, we see, that there is a power struggle, power imbalance rather is the right word between the parties when you are handling this. And how do you handle that at that time?
Look, it depends. I wish I could give you a one-size-fits-all answer. I'm very conscious, particularly for those that are significantly disempowered, to make sure that they have a voice. So it might be that in my pre-mediation, we've already talked about that challenge, that risk, and we have some plans in place that if it occurs, what are the signs and how do we respond? It might be that I take a more directive role with the person that has more power. So my questions to them might be more directive and challenging, whereas to the people that are feeling more disempowered, I might use a very different style of questioning to help them get the information to the table. Sometimes we need to do more separate sessions to be a bridge. Sometimes we need to make sure those that are disempowered have extra support in the room. They might have another representative. So there becomes different tools that you can use to balance those tensions. Sometimes I even bring in a support person for me. Not that I don't know the answers, but I know the parties need information that they don't have themselves. So in community work, sometimes I'll bring in a legal support person. I can't give legal advice because I'm the mediator, but my legal support person knows in general terms. They won't give specific advice, but generally if this happens and goes to court, this is generally what happens. And it's enough to give people a bit of a deeper understanding about what their options might be. So I manage some of the tensions that way.
But at times it becomes difficult because it conflicts with the neutrality of the mediator. You know, while managing all this, we have to see that our neutrality should not get impacted. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sarah, there's another question. When there's a conflict between creativity and ethics, what should prevail?
Very great question. Look, for me, I have a very clear ethical stand. I think creativity is really key to creating interesting and sustainable solutions, but I have a very clear line in the sand for me around what are those ethical standards. So creativity is welcome, but I also know where my line in the sand is. But my line in the sand may look different to the party's line in the sand around ethics. So sometimes I'll have that conversation too. I might say, hey, look, it sounds like you've been really creative about these solutions and I encourage you to do that. But I need you to understand from my own perspective, this is where my ethics stand. And if you want to go on and have that conversation, it might be better to be conducted outside of mediation, maybe because I'm not willing to endorse that. Now, I've had to do that once. I don't like having to do it, but it was a very clear ethical stand for me. And parties then backtracked from where they were heading and came back onto a line where they were all really happy.
Okay, the next question, Sarah, is when parties are in profound strenuous relationship, they do not want to see each other faces, which we have seen many times. And then also in such situations, how you deal with them, and have any such type of conflict in the parties, and how have you resolved and transferred them, by your expertise into the resolution mode?
Yeah. Look, we certainly as mediators see the best and worst of people. And sometimes we see situations where the relationships have broken down so profoundly that they just can't be in a room together, that they can't see or engage with each other. Sometimes we'll need to do mediation, shuttle mediation between parties. I've certainly done a shuttle mediation between communities before where the risk of violence was so high that we didn't want to bring the parties together. So I would travel 2.5 hours between communities to make sure it was a safe environment, but also that they could work towards resolution. I think that my questioning of parties, particularly on a one-to-one basis, is really important. This pre-mediation, and I talk about this a lot. For myself personally, I put a lot of time into the pre-mediation work. And I don't bring people to mediation unless I'm confident that they're ready and able to at least attempt to get good solutions. So in the pre-mediation, we'll talk about, have you got in workplaces, have you seen your workplace support people? Maybe there's some counselling, maybe you're wrestling, maybe this is too hard for you right now. We can do mediation, but maybe we do it in a little bit of time down the track when you've dealt with these other issues. Because again, if we force people to be engaging in mediation where emotionally they're unsafe, then we actually risk making the situation worse. Here in Western Australia, there are new work health safety legislation that has come in that requires us, all of us, to be responsible for the health, mental wellbeing and safety of people that we're engaging with as consultants. And so I now have an added layer of, is there a risk of mental health? Are they feeling suicidal? Are there other issues that if we do mediation, it may make it worse? So my risk assessment changes then.
Okay. So in India, actually, we have to yet start with this pre-mediation.
Yep.
We are little, I would say, behind that. So in the next question is, in mediation process, how we should resolve multifaceted singular.
Yeah, multifaceted conflicts.
Okay,
Okay,
multifaceted conflict.
multifaceted conflict. Oh yeah, he has changed it.
Thank you.
I was also thinking, what is this?
Look, I have done and do a whole pile of sessions. This is a whole session of itself, multifaceted conflicts. I always start from a position of my assessment. So conflict assessment, I do mapping work, which helps me understand those multifacets of the conflict. And then I can work out, is this my responsibility? Do I have authority on these issues? Which ones can I influence with legitimacy and which ones can't I influence? Also for the parties, which spaces can the parties, do they have authority to influence and which do they not? So we start to narrow down how we can contribute to conflict resolution. Generally, these are also multi-party issues. So we have to have worked with parties around process and authority. We might make a timeline and we might prioritize the issues we deal with because we can't deal with everything at once. So I'll often, hey, we can deal with this one today. We might need to deal with this one down the track. Throughout the process, we might then identify other issues and we park them out on the whiteboard. So we acknowledge that this is an issue, because when we don't talk about what's going on or another facet of the conflict, it starts to consume people's thinking. So putting it visually up on a board is a way for me to help acknowledge to them that this is an issue, but we'll deal with it when we have the right time.
Sarah, there's another question. How far do you think complex process and non-validation be more of disabling or less enabling to the causes of conflict?
I think that when we don't validate people's perspectives in a conflict, that it becomes a barrier to moving forward. So it's like you're layering bricks in a wall. And when we don't validate, people stop listening and taking on things. That's not to say we have to deal with them. Again, that's notion of, hey, I can recognize that this is important for you, but it may not be the right time to do it. I think that complex processes, when we as practitioners overly make a situation or make a process overly complex, it becomes very difficult for people to know what's going on. So as mediators, we've got to have a strategy, and we might have a complex process, but the way that we communicate that to parties needs to be clear and in a way quite simple, because again, remember, we're used to this, mostly they aren't. So we need to make it accessible for them. Hang on, we're on mute.
So sorry. So
That's
another
okay.
I'm so sorry. I was. Okay. The next question is also very good. Is that how, as a mediator, do you encourage emotional breakthroughs in your mediation sessions, or do you try and keep the sessions more objective, as objectivity can be good de-escalation strategy? A very good question.
You're great. I love your questions, everyone. Yeah. Thank you so much. Look, I make it very clear that I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a counselor. I'm not there to help you understand your emotions. But one of the ways that I do deal with this tension is, again, in the pre-mediation. My pre-mediations particularly allow the parties to share their experience of what has happened, how they've got to this point. And we're doing that on a one-to-one basis. What generally happens is a lot of their emotions come out in that space, because I can ask curious questions in a different tone than if the other person was in the room. That then means by the time that I bring parties together, a lot of the emotional heat has already been taken out. They've already been heard. They've already dealt with a number of the emotions, and they're kind of in a place of, okay, I'm ready to try and deal with this now. So that allows me to allow the mediation to be more objective. One of the things that I've adjusted probably over the last 18 months is this notion of particularly complex, often workplace disputes where I don't actually want them to dive down into the emotions, because generally a grievance has been raised, the grievance process has been conducted, and a determination has been made. Often they'll then say, let's do mediation to fix it. Now, if I allowed that mediation to go back over the painful and the frustration of the grievance, what that generally does is stir up all those emotions again, and people just get angry, and it then becomes really hard for them to future focus. So what I do in those cases is really frame the mediation around, this is a mediation not about so much what happened, but how do you move forward? Is moving forward possible? And how can we not fall into the emotions, but rather create some practical ways of making this viable?
Yeah, because here also in India, what we do is the first few minutes, our first few sessions, we actually, the parties, they ventilate. And after, they feel that they have ventilated, then they, go to the other side. Okay, now the ventilation is done. We have told everything.
Absolutely.
We've taken it out of our system. And then now, let's get started with now what?
We're ready.
Yeah, we're ready. Yeah. So that's how it's very, I really like the question also. Nikhil, any other question?
There's another question. How many mediation sessions are required to resolve conflicts?
How long is a piece of string? Look, sometimes it's as simple as, I always do a pre-mediation with parties. Sometimes that can be a quick half an hour session and then a couple of hours together and the matter's resolved. So sometimes when the parties are well prepared, the issue hasn't been embedded, it hasn't been going on for a long time, and perhaps they've got the language and skills to really negotiate well. So they're primed for resolution, these clients. We can pump that out really fast, and they just needed, in a way, a safety blanket. They probably could have done it themselves, but they just needed the added confidence of me involved. Other times I've done mediation work that has occurred over 8 months to 9 months longer. And so it really depends on the duration of the conflict itself. Is it high conflict? Is it multi-party? What are the complex layers of it? I think standard mediations, I personally don't like to hold people in a mediation on one day for longer than 6 hours. And I know that a lot of legal practitioners will push on for a really long mediation session into the night to resolve it. My thinking is that people are exhausted when we ask them to come into a mediation. And if I hold them for longer than that, I know, and the science tells us, that they're no longer able to make good informed decisions. So then we're putting at risk their decision-making capacity. So I would rather do a couple of shorter sessions, but increase their capacity to engage constructively than hold them in the room just to get a quick outcome.
I agree with you on this, because I also do this thing that I give them ample opportunity to go and think about it, so that they should not feel later on that they were, forced, or, they've taken a decision in haste and like that. So it's always better, to take small sessions and then let them go and discuss with their family or whosoever they want to. Yeah. So I don't think people are only praising you now. They are very thankful for your answers. So really, even I learned a lot, because conflict is such a topic. I always find it very difficult when I'm giving a training to explain it at times. But I have also learned in a different way from you. And with your permission, I would also like to carry on the way you are teaching in my sections also. Thank you so much. Yeah.
We would like to welcome Mr. Brian Spears, who is the president of Commonwealth Lawyers Association, and also Mr. Peter Marinan, Vice President, Commonwealth Lawyers Association. He's with us. Both of them are with us today.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Do you want to say some Brent sir, or anybody wants to say something? Want to add on something? We have such senior people with us. It's a very good topic. If anybody wants to add on something, sir, on this.
Well, I'm really grateful for the questions.
Okay.
And it pushes me. I think the more questions are great because it challenges myself in my own thinking and makes me deepen my own discipline. So thank you really genuinely for the opportunity to present. I am in awe, honestly, of the work that you're all doing over there, and particularly the way that I see mediation being engaged with in India. I think it's such an exciting time for how you're approaching this business. And I know that it's going to shape globally how we deal with conflict. So again, my sincere thank yous for this opportunity. And I do wish you all the best. However you engage in this
You
business.
wait, we have to give vote of thanks to you now. It's our turn to say thanks now. Over to Nikhil.
First and foremost, I would like to thank the special guest, Ms. Sarah Blake, a conflict strategist, mediator, corporate trainer, and TEDx speaker, and a second generation practitioner in mediation, for sharing with us your findings, opinions, and professional experiences today on conflict, its styles, management, intervention, resolution, and transformation. I would also like to thank Nivaran, mediators of the Supreme Court of India, for giving me this opportunity. I would also like to thank Mr. Rakesh Khanna, Jitendra Mohan Sharma ji, Rajiv Datta sir, senior advocates, for their unstinted support. Nivaran has been successfully promoting mediation for the past more than 2 years. I would also like to thank Santhanam sir, Reema ji, my co-host, Rahul Kumar, who has just joined the profession and has been with us throughout and forms our backbone in hosting all the webinars. I also thank Mr. A.J. Jawad, who gave me the mediation training. I also thank Ms. Renee M. Baptist, President St. Vincent Bar Association and co-chair ADR Committee, Commonwealth Lawyers Association. I also thank Mr. Brian Spears, President, Commonwealth Lawyers Association, Mr. Peter Maynard, Vice President, Commonwealth Lawyers Association. Finally, I would like to thank our participants who made the third day of this International Virtual Mediation Summer School 2022 a great success. Thank you.
And Sarah has very gracefully given her email ID. If anybody, later on wants to ask any question, you can just note down the email ID. It's there in the chat box also. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so
it was
much.
pleasure meeting you.